The rain fell in gentle sheets against the windows of Mabel's Diner, a small establishment on the outskirts of Los Angeles that had somehow survived the city's relentless modernization. Inside, 85-year-old Eleanor Matthews wiped down the counter with hands that had grown weathered with age, but moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in service to others. Her blue uniform hung a bit loose on her frame now, but she wore it with the same pride she had for the past 15 years at this diner and for the decades of work that came before. "Order up," called the cook, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the pass. Eleanor picked it up, ignoring the familiar ache in her knuckles as she carried the plate to table 4. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said to the young mother with 2 children. "Extra syrup, just like you asked." The woman smiled gratefully, and Eleanor felt that small spark of satisfaction that had kept her going all these years. Little moments of connection, of service, rendered with care. These were the treasures she collected in lieu of a retirement fund. She hadn't planned to still be working at her age. But when her husband died 20 years ago, leaving her with medical bills and a mortgage they'd refinanced to pay for their grandson's college tuition, Eleanor had simply done what she'd always done. She'd worked harder. Even after the house was paid off, she kept working. Her Social Security barely covered her medications, and pride kept her from moving in with her daughter's family, who had their own financial struggles. Eleanor glanced at the clock. 2 more hours until her shift ended. Her lower back throbbed in protest, but she straightened herself as best she could. No time for complaints, no use in them anyway. The bell above the door jingled as a new customer entered, bringing with him a gust of cool air and the scent of expensive cologne. Eleanor didn't look up immediately, busy refilling coffee mugs at the counter. Just another traveler stopping off the highway, she figured. "Table for 1?" she asked, finally turning with a menu in hand. The man stood taller than most, with a baseball cap pulled low and dark sunglasses despite the overcast day. Something about the way he held himself, confident but trying not to draw attention, made Eleanor pause. In her years working in Hollywood homes before the diner, she'd seen enough celebrities to recognize when someone was trying to go incognito. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she found oddly familiar. Eleanor led him to a corner booth, away from the windows. "Special today is the meatloaf," she said, setting down the menu. "Coffee?" "Please," he nodded, removing his sunglasses as he settled into the booth. When Eleanor returned with the coffee pot, she found herself looking into a pair of intensely blue eyes she hadn't seen in person for decades, but which she would recognize anywhere. The coffee pot nearly slipped from her grasp. "Mr. Gibson?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the diner. The man's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners as recognition dawned on his face as well. "Eleanor?" Mel Gibson asked, surprise evident in his tone. "Eleanor Matthews?" Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down on the table, rather than risk pouring it. Yes, it's been a long time, Mr. Gibson." "Nearly 40 years, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You haven't changed a bit." It was a kind lie, the sort that people tell when they're confronted with the reality of time's passage. Eleanor knew exactly how much she had changed from the strong, energetic woman who had once cared for his children when they were small, and he was just beginning to make a name for himself. "You were always a charmer," she replied with a small smile. "What brings you to our little diner? We're not exactly on the celebrity circuit." "Film location scouting," he answered, but his eyes remained fixed on her, studying the changes that 4 decades had wrought. "Eleanor, what are you doing working here?" There was genuine confusion in his voice, as if the math didn't add up, which of course it didn't. A woman of her age should be enjoying retirement, not balancing plates and enduring 8-hour shifts on her feet. "Life happens," she said simply, not wanting to burden him with the details of financial setbacks, medical bills, and the economic reality of aging in America without sufficient savings. "I've always worked. Wouldn't know what to do with myself otherwise." But Mel Gibson had always been observant, a quality that had served him well as an actor and director. He noticed the slight wince as she shifted her weight, the deeper lines around her eyes that spoke of exhaustion rather than just age. "You took care of my kids," he said quietly. You were there during the hardest years, when everything was just taking off, and we were barely keeping it together. Eleanor remembered those days well. The young family, the rising star father often away on film sets, the mother trying to maintain normalcy for the children. Eleanor had been more than just a nanny. She'd been a stabilizing force, a surrogate grandmother, a confidant. They were good kids, she said warmly. I think about them sometimes, wonder how they turned out. They turned out well, Mel said, his voice thick with an emotion Eleanor couldn't quite identify. And I've always thought that had a lot to do with you. A call from another table pulled Eleanor away before she could respond. As she moved through the diner, taking orders and clearing plates, she was acutely aware of Mel Gibson's eyes following her. It was strange being observed like this, especially by someone from a part of her life she had tucked away in memory. Those had been good years, working in beautiful homes for families who treated her well, but they were long past, replaced by the practical necessity of making ends meet however she could. When she returned to his table, he had barely touched his coffee. I'm sorry, she said. What can I get you to eat? Eleanor, he said, ignoring the menu, how long have you been working here? About 15 years now, she answered, surprised by the intensity of his question. And before that? She hesitated. Other diners, a few years as a home health aide. After domestic work fell through, I took what I could get. Mel shook his head slightly, a gesture Eleanor remembered from years ago. It was what he did when something didn't sit right with him, when he was processing information that troubled him. You should be retired, he said finally. Enjoying your grandkids, traveling maybe. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that carried no bitterness despite the circumstances. Should be a lot of things, Mr. Gibson. Life doesn't always work out the way we plan. As she spoke, the weight of her years seemed to settle more heavily on her shoulders. There was no self-pity in her voice, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had learned long ago that the world doesn't owe anyone a comfortable ending. No, Mel agreed quietly. It doesn't. A moment of understanding passed between them, two people who had traveled very different paths from their shared starting point 40 years ago. Eleanor saw in his eyes not pity, which she would have hated, but something more complex, respect, concern, and perhaps a touch of guilt. Let me at least leave you a good tip, he said, reaching for his wallet. Your money's no good here, Mr. Gibson, she replied, surprising herself with the words. It's nice to see you doing well. That's enough for me. As she walked away to tend to her other tables, Eleanor felt a strange sense of closure. The distance between her life and the glamorous world she had once orbited at the periphery had never felt more vast. Yet seeing Mel Gibson sitting in her diner somehow made her journey feel complete, as if the circle of her life was connecting back to itself in unexpected ways. What she didn't notice was the way Mel Gibson watched her go, the way his fingers drummed thoughtfully on the table, or the determined set of his jaw as he pulled out his phone and began to make a call. Eleanor Matthews had once been a crucial part of his family's foundation during his rise to fame, and Mel Gibson was not a man who forgot the people who had helped him along the way. The rain continued to fall outside Mabel's diner, washing away the dust of the day. Inside, Eleanor moved from table to table, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Because while she might have been content to serve coffee and exchange pleasantries with a face from her past, Mel Gibson had recognized something she had long stopped seeing in herself, her worth, her sacrifice, and the profound impact she had once had on his family. And he was not about to let that recognition pass without action. Mel Gibson sat in his rental car outside Mabel's diner, rain drumming steadily on the roof as he finished his third phone call. His production meeting could wait. Some things were more important than location scouting, and the sight of Eleanor Matthews, the woman who had once bandaged his children's scraped knees and soothed their nightmares, shuffling between tables with arthritic hands, had stirred something profound in him. Yes, I understand it's unconventional, he said into the phone, his Australian accent becoming more pronounced, as it always did when he was passionate about something. But I want to know everything. Her financial situation, her health, her living conditions, and I want it done quietly. He paused, listening. By tomorrow. Make it happen. Inside the diner, Eleanor was unaware of the wheels being set in motion. She finished her shift, as she always did, counting her modest tips, saying goodbye to Mabel herself, who owned the place, but rarely worked the floor anymore, and preparing for the bus ride to her small apartment in a part of town that had seen better days. "Eleanor?" called Mel's voice from behind her as she stood at the bus stop, an umbrella that had long ago lost its battle with the wind held gamely over her head. She turned, surprised to see him still there. "Mr. Gibson, I thought you'd be gone by now." "Can I give you a ride home?" he asked, gesturing to his car. Not flashy, she noted, but certainly expensive in an understated way. Eleanor hesitated. Pride had been her companion for too long to easily accept charity, even in the form of a ride on a rainy day. But the bus was running late, her feet ached terribly, and there was something in Mel Gibson's eyes that wasn't pity, but genuine concern. "That would be nice," she finally said. The interior of his car smelled of leather and something faintly woodsy. Eleanor settled into the passenger seat with a small sigh of relief that she couldn't quite suppress. "Where to?" Mel asked. She gave him the address, then added quickly, "It's not much to look at, but it's home." "I've lived in worse," he replied easily, pulling away from the curb. "My first apartment in Hollywood could have doubled as a broom closet." Eleanor smiled at that. "I remember you telling me about that place. You said you could touch all four walls without moving from your bed." "You remember that?" Mel asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "I remember a lot of things," Eleanor said softly. "You used to bring me coffee every morning, even though I was supposed to be the one taking care of things. Said your mother taught you that everyone deserves the dignity of being served sometimes, even those who serve others." A shadow passed over Mel's face. "I'm not sure I've always lived up to my mother's teachings," he said. Eleanor studied his profile as he drove. The years had etched deeper lines around his eyes and mouth, some from laughter, others perhaps from hardship. She knew from occasional glimpses of tabloid headlines that his path hadn't always been smooth. "None of us are perfect," she offered. "We just do our best with what we have at the time." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the rain creating a cocoon of privacy around them as the wipers kept steady time. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" Mel finally asked. "Over the years, I mean. When things got tight." Eleanor considered the question. "It wasn't my place," she said simply. "You were my employer, not my family, and I've always believed in making my own way." "You were more than an employee, Eleanor. You know that." She did know. She remembered Christmas mornings when she'd been invited to join the family rather than serving them. Birthdays when they'd surprised her with gifts. The time Mel had insisted on paying for her nephew's funeral when she couldn't afford it, refusing to take no for an answer. "Maybe I was too proud," she admitted, "or maybe I didn't want to be a reminder of a time in your life that you'd moved beyond." Mel glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Famous people. They evolve. Their circles change. The nanny from the early days doesn't typically fit into the world of premieres and award shows." "That's a pretty cynical view," Mel said, but there was no anger in his tone. "Not cynical, realistic, and I never begrudged you your success. I was proud of you, watching your films over the years. I'd tell people I knew him when." They were approaching her neighborhood now, the buildings growing shabbier, the streets less maintained. Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment as Mel's expensive car drew curious glances from people on the sidewalks. "Just up here on the left," she directed. Mel pulled up in front of a faded apartment building with security bars on the lower windows. He didn't comment on it, for which Eleanor was grateful. "Thank you for the ride," she said, reaching for the door handle. "Eleanor," Mel said, stopping her, "I'd like to catch up properly. Not in the diner where you're working. Maybe I could come by tomorrow? Or you could meet me somewhere." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. "Why?" "Because 40 years is too long to go without talking to someone who was important to your family," he replied simply. There was sincerity in his voice that touched her. Still, she hesitated. "I work tomorrow, noon to close." "Breakfast then?" 8 o'clock. I could pick you up." Against her better judgment, Eleanor nodded. All right, 8 o'clock. As she climbed the 3 flights to her apartment, the elevator had been out of service for months. Eleanor wondered what Mel Gibson could possibly want to discuss with her. Their worlds had diverged so completely that there seemed little point in revisiting the past. Yet there had been something in his manner, a determination that reminded her of the young father she had once known, who would move heaven and earth for those he cared about. Inside her small apartment, Eleanor went through her evening routine. A simple dinner, a hot bath to ease her aching joints, her medications lined up neatly on the bathroom counter. As she settled into her worn armchair with a mug of tea, her mind drifted to memories long buried. She remembered Mel as a young father, juggling his growing career with family responsibilities, the constant pressure he put on himself to provide and succeed. She remembered late nights when he'd return from filming, exhausted but still taking time to peek in on his sleeping children. The way he'd sit at the kitchen table, running lines while she prepared the next day's lunches. The genuine gratitude in his eyes when she would make sure the house ran smoothly during his absences. Eleanor had cared for many children in her lifetime, worked for many families, but the Gibsons had been special. They had treated her with respect, included her in their lives beyond her duties. When she'd eventually moved on to another family as their needs changed, there had been genuine sadness on both sides. And now, decades later, their paths had crossed again, as if guided by some invisible hand of fate. Eleanor took her last sip of tea and rose slowly to prepare for bed. Tomorrow would come early, and she wasn't sure what it would bring. But for the first time in years, she felt a flutter of curiosity about the future. Across town, in a luxury hotel suite, Mel Gibson was on the phone again, this time with his financial advisor. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying, his voice low and intense. "This woman helped raise my children. She's working herself to death at an age when she should be resting. I want options on my desk by morning." As he hung up, Mel walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked city below. His mind was racing with possibilities, with plans taking shape that would change Eleanor's life forever. But he knew her well enough to remember her pride, her independence. This would require delicacy, respect for her dignity. It wasn't charity he wanted to offer, it was justice, a balancing of scales that had tipped unfairly. Tomorrow would be the first step, and Mel Gibson was a man who, once committed to a path, would see it through to the end, no matter what obstacles might arise. Eleanor woke before her alarm, a lifetime of early rising, too ingrained to break even on what might be her one opportunity to sleep in. Dawn was just beginning to filter through her thin curtains as she dressed carefully in her best outfit, a simple navy blue dress she saved for church and special occasions. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to impress Mel Gibson. He had seen her in a diner uniform just yesterday, after all. But something about meeting him properly away from her workplace stirred a desire to present her best self. At precisely 8 o'clock, a gentle knock came at her door. Eleanor opened it to find Mel standing there, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking more like the young father she had once known than the Hollywood icon he had become. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said warmly. "You look lovely." "You always were a charmer," she replied with a small smile, locking her door behind her, "even at 5 in the morning with a colicky baby." Mel laughed at that. "Hannah was a terror at night. I remember you walking her for hours, singing those Irish lullabies." She always settled for Tura Lura Lura, Eleanor remembered, surprised at how easily the memories returned, how fresh they felt despite the decades that had passed. Instead of his rental car, a sleek black town car waited at the curb, a driver standing at attention beside it. Eleanor raised an eyebrow at Mel. "I thought we'd do breakfast in style," he explained, offering her his arm. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting, allowing him to guide her down the steps she navigated with increasing difficulty each day. The driver opened the door for them, and Eleanor sank into the plush leather seat with an involuntary sigh of comfort. "Where are we going?" she asked as the car pulled smoothly away from the curb. "There's a place near the beach," Mel said. "Best pancakes in California, or so I'm told, and the view isn't bad either." As they drove through the awakening city, the conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had expected. Mel told her about his children, now grown with families of their own, and his current projects. He asked about her family, listening intently as she spoke of her daughter in Phoenix, her 3 grandchildren, and the great-grandchild she had only seen in photos. "Why don't you live closer to them?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes watchful. Eleanor looked out the window at the passing scenery. "My daughter wanted me to move in with them years ago, but her house is small, and they're just getting by themselves. I'd be another mouth to feed, another expense." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "I've always paid my own way, Mel. I wasn't about to stop just because I got old." Mel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Independence matters to you." "It's all I've really had," she answered simply. The restaurant was situated on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, a glass-walled haven where the wealthy came to see and be seen. As they were led to a prime table with a panoramic view of the ocean, Eleanor was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way, not at her, but at the famous man beside her. "You're causing quite a stir," she murmured as they sat down. Mel waved a dismissive hand. "Let them wonder. I'm having breakfast with an old friend." The word friend warmed Eleanor in a way she hadn't expected. Yes, she had been an employee, but there had always been something more to their relationship, a mutual respect and affection that transcended the typical boundaries. As they enjoyed their meal, the pancakes were indeed excellent. Mel gradually steered the conversation toward Eleanor's current circumstances. "The diner, is it good work?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question. "It's work," she said finally. "Mabel is fair. The customers are mostly decent. The tips aren't great, but they help make ends meet." "And your health?" Mel asked, his eyes taking in the slight tremor in her hands that she tried to hide, the careful way she shifted in her seat to accommodate her aching back. "I get by," she replied, unwilling to catalog her various ailments, the prescriptions she sometimes had to skip when money was tight, the specialist appointments she had canceled because they weren't covered by Medicare. Mel set down his fork, his expression turning serious. "Eleanor, I want to help you." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "I don't need charity, Mel." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's an overdue retirement package." When she looked skeptical, he continued, "You gave years of your life to my family during a crucial time. You helped shape my children into the people they are today. That has value, immeasurable value." "I was paid for those years," she reminded him. "Not enough," Mel countered. "Not by today's standards, and certainly not enough to secure your future." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "Eleanor, you shouldn't be on your feet all day at 85. You should be comfortable, able to visit your family, enjoy your great-grandchild." Eleanor looked away, out toward the vast ocean. The truth of his words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they exposed the careful facade she had maintained for so long, the pretense that her life had turned out exactly as she had planned, that working well past retirement age was a choice rather than a necessity. "I've set up a trust," Mel continued gently. "It would provide you with a monthly income, enough to live comfortably, to retire immediately if you choose. There's also a lump sum for any medical expenses, travel to see your family, whatever you need." Eleanor's head snapped back to face him, shock evident in her expression. "You've already done this, without asking me?" "The paperwork is drawn up," Mel acknowledged, "but nothing is finalized. It's your decision, Eleanor. I just wanted to have everything ready if you said yes." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Mel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Do you remember when Hannah had pneumonia? She was about 3, I think. I was filming, on location in some godforsaken place, and I couldn't get home." Eleanor nodded. She remembered that time vividly, the little girl's labored breathing, the fear, the long nights. "You stayed with her for 4 days straight," Mel continued. "Barely slept. You sang to her, read to her, held her when the fever made her cry." His voice grew rough with emotion. "When I finally got home, you were exhausted, but you were still there, holding my daughter, making sure she knew she wasn't alone." Eleanor remembered. She had loved those children as if they were her own. That's just one moment, Mel said. One of hundreds where you went above and beyond, where you gave pieces of your heart to my family. And then life went on, and I lost track of you, and somehow 40 years passed. He shook his head, regret evident in his features. I can't go back and change that, but I can make sure that the years you have left are comfortable, dignified, lived on your own terms. Eleanor sat very still, overwhelmed by his words, by the generosity of his offer, and by the surge of emotions that threatened to breach the careful dam she had built around her heart. Pride warred with practicality, independence with the undeniable reality of her situation. I don't know what to say, she admitted finally. Mel reached across the table, covering her weathered hand with his. Say you'll think about it. That's all I ask. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon, waves crashing against the cliffs below in a rhythm as old as time. Eleanor gazed at the water, feeling as though she stood at a similar precipice in her own life, looking out at an unexpected vista of possibilities she had long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. I'll think about it, she promised softly. What she didn't say, what she held close to her heart, was that Mel's offer represented more than financial security. It was recognition of her worth, an acknowledgement that her years of service, not just to his family, but to all the families she had cared for, all the diner patrons she had served, had meaning, that she had meaning. And for a woman who had spent a lifetime putting others first, that recognition was perhaps the greatest gift of all. 3 days had passed since Mel's offer, 3 days in which Eleanor had continued her shifts at the diner, wiping tables and serving coffee as she had for 15 years, all while his words echoed in her mind. 3 days in which she had alternated between grateful tears and stubborn resistance, between practical acceptance and fierce pride. 3 days of imagining a different kind of life, one where her back didn't ache quite so badly at night, where she could visit her great-grandchild without counting pennies, where she could wake up without the immediate pressure of making ends meet. She hadn't given Mel her answer yet. He'd left her with a business card, not his personal number, but that of his financial advisor, a gesture that somehow made his offer seem more legitimate and less like charity. Take all the time you need, he'd said as they parted after breakfast. The offer doesn't expire. The diner was unusually busy for a Wednesday afternoon. Eleanor moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her mind elsewhere as her body performed the familiar routines. She was delivering a tuna melt to table 6 when the bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to see not one but several people enter. Mel Gibson, accompanied by a middle-aged woman and man who looked strikingly like him, and an elderly gentleman in an impeccable suit. Eleanor nearly dropped her tray. She knew those faces, though they had aged considerably since she'd last seen them in person. Hannah and Edward Gibson, the children she had once rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose tears she had dried. Mel's kids, now well into their 40s. "Eleanor!" called Mel, his voice carrying across the diner and drawing curious stares from the other patrons. She set down the tuna melt with shaking hands and made her way toward them, smoothing her apron self-consciously. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes moving from Mel to his children in wonder. Hannah stepped forward first, her eyes, so like her father's, filling with tears. "Dad told us he found you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't believe it." Before Eleanor could respond, Hannah had enveloped her in a tight hug. The familiar scent of her shampoo, something floral and expensive, mingled with the unfamiliar sensation of being held by someone she had once held as a child. The role reversal was disorienting, but not unwelcome. "You're so tall," Eleanor said foolishly when Hannah finally released her, making everyone laugh. Edward stepped forward next, more reserved than his sister, but with unmistakable warmth in his eyes. "Miss Eleanor," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "you haven't changed a bit." It was a lie, of course, but a kind one, the sort that acknowledged the unchanging essence of a person despite the physical transformations of time. "You were always such a gentleman," Eleanor replied, squeezing his hand, "even at 4 years old." Mabel appeared from the back, wiping her hands on her apron and eyeing the group with curiosity. "Everything all right, Eleanor?" Yes, Eleanor said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Her world felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. These are old friends from a long time ago. Take your break, Mabel said, surprising Eleanor with her generosity. Take as long as you need. The group settled into the diner's largest booth, ordered coffee all around, and began the strange, beautiful process of reconnecting across decades. Hannah and Edward shared stories of their lives, careers, marriages, children of their own, while Eleanor listened with the particular pride of someone who had contributed to their foundations. I've thought of you so often over the years, Hannah admitted. Whenever I'm unsure about how to handle something with my own kids, I ask myself, what would Eleanor do? You sing the same lullabies you used to sing to us, Edward added. My wife noticed it once, asked where I learned them. I told her about you. Each word was a gift, a confirmation that her years of service had left an imprint that extended far beyond the immediate tasks she had performed. Eleanor had always believed that caring for children was important work, but sitting across from these accomplished adults who still carried her influence within them was proof in a way she had never expected to receive. The elderly gentleman in the suit, who had been introduced as Mr. Harrington, Mel's financial advisor, eventually cleared his throat. Mrs. Matthews, if I may, he began, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Eleanor tensed slightly, but Mel raised a hand. That's not why we're here today, Bill. Not yet. Instead, Hannah reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo album. We brought something for you, she said, sliding it across the table. With trembling fingers, Eleanor opened the album. Inside were photos she had never seen, candid shots of her with the Gibson children from 40 years ago. Eleanor reading to Hannah on the couch. Eleanor helping Edward with his first bicycle. Eleanor at the kitchen table, head thrown back in laughter at something off camera. Where did these come from? She asked, her voice barely audible. Mom kept them, Edward explained. She always said you were the backbone of our family during those early years. Eleanor couldn't speak, overcome by the visual evidence of a life she had lived so fully, but had few tangible reminders of. Here was proof that she had mattered, that her presence had been not just necessary but cherished. Mel watched her quietly, his eyes gentle. When she finally looked up at him, he said softly, You were family, Eleanor. You still are. And in that moment, something shifted in Eleanor's heart. The pride that had kept her working long past when she should have stopped, the independence that had become a rigid shield against vulnerability. They didn't disappear, but they softened, making room for the possibility that accepting help from someone who considered her family wasn't charity but connection, the closing of a circle that had remained open for too long. I think, she said slowly, that I'm ready to discuss your offer, Mel. Relief washed over his features. Good, he said simply. As Mr. Harrington began to outline the details of the trust Mel had established, a monthly stipend that was more than Eleanor had ever earned, a lump sum for immediate needs, health insurance that would cover the treatments she had been putting off. Eleanor found herself looking not at the papers, but at the faces around her. At Hannah, who had her father's eyes but her mother's gentle smile. At Edward, serious and thoughtful, the little boy who had once followed Eleanor around the house, asking endless questions, now a man with answers of his own. At Mel, whose success had taken him far from the young father she had known, but whose heart, it seemed, had remained true. The world outside Mabel's diner continued its usual rhythm, cars passing on the street, pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalk, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the windows. But inside, time seemed to fold in on itself, bringing past and present together in a moment of recognition and reconciliation. When the papers were signed and the details settled, when promises had been made for future visits and connections maintained, Mel asked Eleanor one final question. What will you do first? When you don't have to work anymore? Eleanor thought about it, the possibilities suddenly endless, where before they had been so constrained. I think, she said slowly, I'll go see my great-granddaughter in Phoenix. She's walking now, and I've only seen pictures. Hannah reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. Dad's got a plane, she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. I bet he could be convinced to make a detour to Phoenix before heading back to LA. Eleanor looked at Mel, who nodded with a smile. Consider it done. As they left the diner together, Eleanor having given Mabel notice in a conversation filled with disbelief on the older woman's part and genuine promises to stay in touch, Eleanor felt a curious lightness. The weight of financial worry, of physical strain, of lonely independence had been lifted, replaced by something she had not felt in many years: belonging. On the sidewalk outside, Mel offered her his arm, much as he had done 3 days earlier when they had gone to breakfast. But this time, when Eleanor took it, it wasn't as a former employee accepting courtesy from a one-time employer. It was as family, the circle of connection complete, the years between forgotten, the future suddenly bright with possibilities neither of them had imagined just days before. "Ready?" Mel asked. Eleanor nodded, looking back once at the diner where she had spent so many years, then forward to the waiting car, to Phoenix, to a great-granddaughter's smile, to a life transformed by an unexpected reunion. "I'm ready," she said, and together they stepped forward into that new beginning.